Hello and welcome to Access Studio. My name is Nancy Gesimondo, and today I'm very pleased to be visiting the studio of Erwin Redl, an Austrian-born artist who creates large-scale light installations. Erwin maintains his studio here in the Silks building in Long Island City, as well as a 9,000 square foot production facility in Bowling Green, Ohio. That space also serves as the headquarters of his company, Paramedia. Erwin's work offers an immersive experience that fosters moments of elation, serenity, and often transcendence. It bridges the borders between the viewer and the viewed. Erwin obtained a BA in Composition and Electronic Music from the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna. He was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship for Computer Art and obtained his MFA at the School of Visual Arts here in New York City. He has spent years coding as a former composer and a multimedia artist. The ephemeral nature of his medium is the basis of his interest in conceptual and minimal art. Hi, Erwin. Thank you so much for having me in your studio today.
Thank you, Nancy, for inviting me. It's great.
You're welcome. Can you share with us a little bit about where you grew up and what inspired you to be an artist?
I grew up in a very rural community in Lower Austria, which is the area around Vienna. And so it was a tiny village, and my father had a furniture company. It was very, quintessential to me how I understood the world, because I understood immediate materials, volume, how things work with space, and his biggest client was the church, actually, the Roman Catholic Church, of course. And so we spent very often Sundays going to churches and measuring and drafting floor plans of churches. There was a big influence just understanding space.
And what were some of the key moments that led you to pursue art as a career?
I was sent to a polytechnic high school with an emphasis on furniture making and interior design, so my education was very visual, obviously, also technical. And but then I was more interested in music, and so I started music in college, and then through computer programming mostly, I got the idea that actually what interests me is structure. In a very, really abstract way. So whatever we see here in our environment or whatever we listen to is just one possible shape or form of an underlying structure. And that structure can express itself, in notes, in music, or maybe poetry, or maybe visual art. But there's some inherent, conceptual structural underpinning, and I was very interested in it, because the computer basically says, I don't really care what you give me. It's ones and zeros when it goes down to a basic level. What the medium is that expresses that in that abstract shape. It could be music, it could be sound, I could make abstract poetry, feed abstract words into a computer, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't, the medium was, I hate to say secondary, but I say secondary. It was this complete abstract space that had no footing in the real world. But then you can plug your abstract thoughts that you express in computer code into the quote-unquote real world and say, oh, this is music, or this is, let's say, poetry. You can just say you use time-based structures as music, but the computer run it through a computer, basically. So there was this kind of link, this nexus between those two worlds, and that tied it to me together. So the nexus was the computer. At the end, it's your mind, and you use the computer as a tool, and then you plug in a medium. So it could be sound, visual, whatever.
That's fascinating. So just as a side note, I'm curious about how it would transfer into a visual interpretation. Can you literally dream up anything that you could code into a visual expression?
Yes and no. There are inherent limitations in any medium, obviously, or in any tool. The computer has certain capabilities, and you work with those capabilities.
You note that the social phenomenon is integral to the experience, and that the use of the lights as the medium relates to virtual reality. How do you connect the dots between those ideas?
Agenda of virtual reality is to create an alternative universe that has certain parameters of our reality. So there's space, for example. So you can walk through a virtual space. There's time involved. So There might be a daylight situation or a nightlight situation. There's sound involved. Basically, it mimics our world, but makes it virtual and it's digital, so you can alter it at your will. My first, like medium was the computer, because I liked the coding aspect, I liked the abstractness of it, but then you have to transfer it out of the computer, because the computer would just be code. So it could be on a monitor, it could be projections, or I made installation with slide projectors, and they were timed by a computer and so on and so forth. I ended up showing at a lot of multimedia festivals, computer art festivals, and so on and so forth. And the discussion was always about the tool, like how many megahertz or tera something, And I'm like, I'm not interested in it. I'm as a tool, I am. But for the viewer shouldn't think about the computer, the viewer shouldn't think about cables, the viewer shouldn't think about mega, giga, or nano, or anything. It's distracting. And because the art that I was interested in was very abstract or ephemeral, and of course obvious connections are to Dan Flavin, James Turrell, Nancy Hall, to Agnes Martin. I mean, everybody who worked in a very, very abstract world. Solivit, we can talk about Solivit for hours in that respect. So I tried to keep my tool, which was the computer and accessories. I tried to keep it separate from the medium. In 1997, I went to the Deer Center, saw Fred Sandbeck's show. And I knew Fred Sandbeck's show from catalogs, I saw his drawings and so on, and was always intrigued by it. But experiencing this work in a space, in a time-based space, because any space is time-based because you walk through it, it completely hit me. It was like my world just changed 180 degrees, because I went back to my studio, which was at PS1 at that point, and I packed all my computers away and then started to string little wires from the ceiling and sort of little LEDs in between, because I realized he achieved this extreme level of abstraction with the most minimal tool, like little acrylic yarn, and at the same time, or just because of it, it had this intense corporeal impact, at least on me. I mean, I felt it like, I don't know, an organ toccata by Johann Sebastian Bach. It was physical. It was like funny strings. It was like the space vibrated. With no means. I mean, no means, like almost no means, with completely abstract little lines.
Lovely.
And I was like, I was just completely, my life just changed. And it was clear, like, what I did was great, but I was just practicing. What the computer did so far to me was just practice to something completely else. So I used then the idea of the abstract space that I had in the computer, like old wireframe models, or like early computer renderings, much more than highly rendered environments, and tried to translate that aesthetic into real, quote-unquote, architectural space. So I strung copper wires from floor to ceiling, sort of little LEDs in between, emphasize the edges of a room. And so it was this kind of idea like, oh, now I'm in space. I'm not confined to the silly computer or to a silly projection. And that's where virtual reality comes in. So instead of being tied to like virtual reality goggles or data gloves or any of those gizmos that people have to wear to experience virtual reality, no, I'm in real space, but it looks like virtual reality because I use the visual signifiers or symbols of virtual reality, like lines to delineate space and so on.
So which piece are you describing as you discuss this issue?
Yes, in this quote-unquote early phase, starting like 1997, I started a series called Matrix. So Matrix just basically uses a title of saying like everything that's grid-based and monochrome, I call a matrix, because it is. Right. And the main parameter is that
the physical space.
The physical space defined by a grid.
So that particular project was in 2 locations, Krems, Austria, and in Paris, France. It was
actually in many, many locations. I have like 15 or 20 matrix pieces. Okay. And then you can say like, how do you name them? Because I have matrix 1, matrix 2, matrix 3, and they go to 13, but then they are different spaces. So at one point it's just a matrix and say wherever it's installed. It can be actually the same piece, but it might be bigger, smaller, different grid ratios depending on where installed.
And those pieces the public can walk through, correct?
It depends. I mean, now we're talking numbers. Now, Matrix 1 was just a simple square grid in green, allude to like early computer screens, because early computer screens was a black monitor with phosphor green. And it's still, right now it almost has a retro feeling, like almost nostalgic. Now we see like a green, like this green screen, it's like, oh, that's so sweet. It's like we see like a sunset, and then we're like, it's a phosphor, it's green. But at one point it was cutting edge technology, and I was like, oh, it's romantic, or it's like using like violin,
right.
theremin, it's like it's romantic. And but I like the idea of using this green of the LED in grid as a reference to that early computer stack. So that was Matrix 1. Matrix 2 used also grids, but much larger in a three-dimensional space where you could walk through. And I had a very big piece at Mocha, I had the Krems, and this Matrix 2 actually traveled in Korea, Turkey, France, or like Germany. It was like, now we're coming also to the question about the social aspect of it, because if we are sitting here in the real world, so we know this is a real chair, so if I grab it, it's a real chair. You're quote unquote a real person, I assume so.
Maybe not.
And everybody else is too, and everything is real. It's a real floor. We cannot fall to the floor. And but if you would be in Matrix 2, you would think this is virtual. You could almost think you could like fly through the room, because it's so abstract that you don't think you're like your real me or you're your real you. And you behave very differently. It's just like we're an avatar. I mean, that's like a virtual person, a virtual persona in a virtual room, despite the fact that it's real, but the impression that it leaves, because it's so abstract, that people think, oh, they are really in a different room, like in a different world.
You mentioned Sol LeWitt, and he had noted that the idea itself is the work of art, and like an architect who produces a blueprint for others to create the structure. Do you subscribe to that construct in terms of making your own art?
I absolutely subscribe to that idea. It's basically the foundation of what I do anyway. I'm very interested, I mentioned before, in the medium itself, exploring its possibility from tactile to technical aspects of it. But at the end, the idea is what counts. So I need to explore the medium to know what I can do. And then I either partially do it myself or did everything in the beginning myself, but then I hire experts who can cast something, who can weld something, who can be very often electronic engineers that design circuit boards and so on. I can't manufacture circuit boards, obviously. So then we have to hire a company to manufacture those parts. But at the end, they all come together in my studio and we assemble them, and then we install them at site, so I hire a crew to install it. So it's a long process, but the core is the idea, and then it branches out to different, trades, experts, comes back into my studio, and then we install.
I'm always curious about the starting point of an idea. What inspired the Reflection series?
The starting points in regards to Reflection series, I did a very big public art piece at the New York Police Academy. At night you actually see the Police Academy atrium illuminated by a big work of mine. And they had a very nice font, saying New York Police Academy. And the lights point towards the wall. Actually, the wall is illuminated, and I thought it's very elegant. I want to run with this idea in my abstract world. And then I started to experiment. And I just made a bar and illuminated the background behind the bar with programmable lights. So it was this very simple, like one moment, I thought, let's play with this a little bit. And then a whole series, is still developing out of this initial idea.
What I find interesting about that series is they are panels of lights in various configurations with the zeros and the ones, the binary coding, correct? And they are mounted on a wall like a traditional piece of art. But yet, the collection of them in the interior of the gallery creates a complete installation of sorts. And I find that's really cool how it's like both. And how do you see that working?
And that's part of the medium. With light art, it's very, very difficult because light is the medium. So if the light of one piece bleeds into another artist's piece, it's very difficult. So it's very hard to make a group show with James Turrell, obviously.
Right.
And so So that's the risk factor in group shows with light artists. But if you have a solo show, which I had at the whole gallery in 2019, I have this big room to myself. And so it creates this environment that changes color all the time, because piece A bled into piece B and bled into piece C, but as a whole they created this ever-changing environment.
So far we've talked about the pieces that have been interior installations, and one of the series that I really like is the Seeing Spartanburg in a New Light series, and that was 9 separate installations in the city of Spartanburg, South Carolina. And the piece that I really liked, there were many, but the one that I just was like, oh my gosh, I want to go there, is the Islands of Light. Can you talk about that piece in regard to the environment and what you wanted people to see and feel as they experienced the installation?
Let me just describe Islands of Light. My team and I built 8 islands, and then we placed them or floated them in a gigantic elliptical shape on Duncan Park Lake in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So it's a gigantic, it was basically a land art, water art. So the idea was just to use, that lake as a canvas because it reflected. And it's embedded in a beautiful wooded area, very serene place. And then each island had 16 fiberglass rods, and they were 16 feet high. And so they were swaying in the wind, and on top of that fiberglass rod, we had a high brightness white light, so the same lights that you see like on masts of ship, for example. And I could control those lights, so I could basically fade it in and fade it out. So I could create wave patterns circling every island, and then all those islands were in sync or ran like the opposite direction, or they were all fading in and out. So it was a very simple...
It was like choreography.
Exactly.
This is helping me connect the dots to the first question about the poetry and the connection of the materials that we discussed earlier.
Yeah. So it is composing, architecture, choreographing. So all of this kind of like, I create certain blueprints, and in this case, I had those lights, but in the kinetic context of the lake, because I couldn't basically control the wind, obviously. So those fiberglass rods were just swaying depending on the wind draft, and so it was interacting with the forces of nature. Then you have the waves, and so it was embedded in this very beautiful environment. Outdoors, you won't have like the virtual reality effect. Sometimes it's seen in this video that we shot of that piece. You see those, it was shot from a drone, and you see those circles like making those contours on the lake, and then suddenly there was a car, like following along the road, and you can choreograph that. It just happens. This kind of happenstance is the beauty of art in the public, realm, or it's outside the white cube or the museum. The things that you cannot predict.
Sure.
Then in 2017, I got the wonderful opportunity to work in Madison Square Park.
Let's talk about that piece for a minute.
Of course.
So that piece, you had a grid suspended, and then filaments, and then the white clear spheres with white LEDs, and they were the lights were programmed, but the filaments themselves just were a victim of, for lack of a better word,
yes,
the wind.
A willing victim.
Yes. A willing victim, yes. That was so beautiful. So a year later, Whiteout had a second iteration in Oklahoma City, and it had such a different vibe, totally different in feeling, sensibility. I guess because I was looking at the drone footage, seemed more, it seemed less like it was blowing in the wind, and that even those movements were controlled. How do you deal with that difference in space and context?
There's a long story behind Spartanburg, because they were one of the 4 cities that won the Bloomberg Philanthropist Public Art Challenge grant. The space in Oklahoma City was much, much different than New York City, obviously. And then so I used those modular possibilities and made a piece that's much, much longer. It was narrower, but longer. It It was kind of the same amount of spheres, but in a different shape. And then it was along a major road, so it looked like on the video with the drone footage that the lights were synchronized to the movement of the cars, but that's our mind just trying to. We are such helpless individuals, or in the humanity. We always try to make sense of everything, but there was no sense. There was no relationship between the lights, my lights, and the car lights. But people say, "Oh, it's synchronized," but it ain't. It's just we try to make sense.
However, in the piece where there's a lot of reflection on the water, like in the Miami Royal Caribbean terminal,
yes,
there's so much going on within the building, and which is right on the water.
But of course, then there are all those beautiful things like Islands of Light, Miami, the Royal Caribbean cruise line terminal. It's like it's happening anyway. For me, it's like just better if I go to a museum, or to a concert, or to a poetry reading, or to a restaurant, without the stress of me having to give input. So I don't want to have that.
That's the good point.
I don't want to have that kind of like gaming, competitive, like mindset if I go to a show.
Yeah.
If I want to go to the MoMA and see, I don't know, the Ellsworth Kelly XYZ, I just want to sit there and let it do its magic,
Right. Another of the Spartanburg pieces was river poetry, which I really liked very much because it was also out in nature. And can you just tell me how many bands of poems were there within the path?
I don't know the exact number, but it was like between 16 and 25. So it was a
fair amount,
but it wasn't infinite.
Right.
So it was a path along a creek or river. It was halfway in between, depending on the season. And you could partially see the river, or partially you could not see the river. And the path was kind of in one direction along the river, but it was weaving, so it wasn't like a straight path. And so we placed a running LED sign. So we hung those running LED signs. So they were roughly, I think they were 6 or 8 feet wide, and I think 10 inches high. And it was very low res, and I call it Jenny Holzer for the people, So it was like you see Jenny Holzer, basically, it's one of her signature media is those running LED signs that she uses with her saying. She doesn't call it poetry. And I find her work absolutely brilliant, of course. And so we hung those, and they were just very simple, so that the physical appearance of them doesn't have any significance. It was basically just a block of LEDs. And they were hung roughly off the ground, maybe 16 feet or so. So you can reach them, you can climb up there, and they're above you. And so they're floating there above that path. And then I was working with a local poetry group, and they were just had the option, so every month or so to feature a different group of poets on this nature path.
How nice.
It was just poetry. So it wasn't meant to be like a scientific anything. It was just art. Yeah, it was very poetic. I liked the juxtaposition of the completely like harsh LED light. It was just white, and it's a very cold white, It was a very harsh, abstract white, This idea that this kind of the abstract structure of it penetrates the natural world. And this idea of this, like, it's almost like computer code is bleeding into the real world.
Yes.
And I like the idea that there are a couple of scenes in Blade Runner, or in the Terminator, where you see the world through the Terminator's eyes, and you see here all this computer code instructions. And I like the idea of that you kind of peel the surface of the real world. And it was very beautiful, because during the day, you saw the physicality of those displays. So, and you see them in the video that we'll show. But at night, you didn't see any of it. You just saw those words running in the woods. It was like ghosts talking to you. It was very, very beautiful.
Loved it.
And that's also the idea that the work, of course, is autonomous. It's an independent artwork. And I'm not a poet. I would never put any of my words up there. But at the same time, the work is also an infrastructure.
So are these permanent pieces?
No, they were partially permanent. Some of them are still right now in Spartanburg, but they were up for a year. Some of them were up for 2 years or so. And that was the idea of, like art as an infrastructure. It's not just a monolithic, autonomous piece, but it can be used for something quote unquote else.
You have several projects going on concurrently in any given year in many different places in the world. How do you manage R&D and installation, etc., logistics?
Early, I have a company, so I basically have a little company. I have employees. Like I'm a small entrepreneur, for lack of a better word. And but any art studio that works on a larger scale works like this. So I have an office manager, and they have a lead technician, and they have a digital media expert, and I'm kind of make sure they all get paid at the right time. And if somebody asks me what my medium is, it's a spreadsheet.
I'm curious about what you're working on now, and one of the pieces I've read about is Lucy in the Sky. Can you talk about that piece?
Yeah, Lucy in the Sky is actually the piece that I've worked on the longest, probably in my life, maybe, I don't know. But from start to finish, it was more than 10 years.
Wow.
So it was a public art competition from the city of San Francisco for a subway station at Union Square, Market Street. I made a little, model or mock-up of the actual light unit that I want to use, and they were arranged in a diamond grid. So it's Lucy in the Sky with diamonds, So now I just shortcut this Lucy in the Sky.
And there are no images yet.
There are no images
yet.
Not born
yet.
I signed the contract in 2010, and just recently, now it's April, I came back from San Francisco just before Easter. Or actually I flew back the Easter weekend and finished the programming.
Thank you for tuning in to Access Studio today. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Erwin Rettel and that you'll tune in next time. You may also visit past episodes of Access Studio on the YouTube channel, where you can leave a comment for the artist, and please consider subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to purchase any of the artwork shown in this video, please see the closing credits for Erwin's contact information. Thanks for watching.